Was winter supposed to save the offensive or expose it? That question began circulating quietly as frozen fields around Kupiansk and northern Kharkiv turned from a promised highway into a battlefield maze where expectations collapsed faster than temperatures. For months, the cold season had been framed as a natural ally, a predictable force that would harden ground, stabilize supply routes, and weaken defenders. Instead, winter arrived as an unforgiving auditor, revealing every logistical shortcut, every inflated report, and every strategic gamble taken earlier in the campaign. As temperatures dropped well below freezing, the assumption was simple armored formations would finally move with speed, breaking through defensive belts and forcing a decisive shift before spring. Kupiansk, a railway hub and logistical hinge in eastern Ukraine, became the centerpiece of this thinking. Control of the city promised momentum, access, and psychological impact. Yet while official statements suggested progress and consolidation, a different reality unfolded on the ground. Small, scattered units found themselves isolated in industrial districts, sheltering in basements, and abandoned structures cut off from resupply and command. What was described as control increasingly looked like containment of Russian troops by circumstance rather than enemy maneuver. The cold did not freeze Ukrainian resistance as expected. Instead, it magnified existing weaknesses. Fuel-thickened batteries drained faster, and machinery that required constant maintenance began failing under sustained exposure. Radios went silent, not from jamming, but from dead power cells. Vehicles that could not be moved became liabilities, their heat signatures visible against the snow. Winter stripped away the margin for error that modern warfare rarely forgives, and it did so without discrimination. This was not a sudden collapse, but an accumulation of pressure. Earlier momentum had been purchased at high cost, with reserves committed aggressively to demonstrate progress. Gains shrank week by week as losses mounted, and by the time winter fully set in, the offensive had lost elasticity. When weather removed flexibility altogether, units at the front discovered there was no buffer left. Reinforcements were delayed, rotations stalled, and evacuation became risky. The result was not dramatic retreat, but something more corrosive: stagnation under fire. Kupiansk became symbolic, not because of a single event, but because it exposed the gap between expectation and execution. Winter, once marketed as a strategic multiplier, instead amplified surveillance, precision strikes, and attrition. Frozen terrain limited maneuver options while making infantry movement slower and more visible. Snow erased cover and simplified targeting. The environment itself favored those who could observe, strike remotely, and wait. In that equation, endurance mattered more than mass. The psychological effect of this reversal rippled quickly. Soldiers who had been told to expect breakthroughs found themselves holding ground. They could not secure defending positions that no longer fit a coherent plan. Confidence eroded as stories circulated of neighboring units unable to move, unable to communicate, or unable to withdraw. Winter nights became longer, not just in hours, but in uncertainty. The promise that time was on their side no longer felt credible. Beyond the front lines, the shift carried strategic weight. Winter campaigns are not just about territory. They are about proving resilience. Failing to convert seasonal advantage into results raises uncomfortable questions about planning, readiness, and leadership. It also hands the initiative psychologically and operationally to the defender. What was meant to be a period of pressure turned into a pause filled with risk. As Kupiansk remained contested and Kharkiv's approaches hardened into kill zones rather than corridors, one conclusion became unavoidable: winter had not changed the balance in the expected direction. Instead, it exposed how dependent the strategy had become on assumptions rather than adaptability. And if winter could dismantle those assumptions so thoroughly in one sector, what might it reveal across the rest of the front as the season deepened? How does an army built to defend a capital city end up immobilized in frozen fields hundreds of miles from home? That question began to haunt analysts as the condition of Russia's first Guards tank army became impossible to ignore. Once regarded as a cornerstone of military prestige, this formation was designed for speed shock and decisive action. Its presence alone was meant to signal escalation and inevitability. Yet by early 2026, that image had eroded into something far less formidable, an overstretched force struggling to function under sustained pressure. The army entered the campaign with a reputation shaped by decades of doctrine. It was structured around heavy armor, professional cadres, and priority access to equipment and supplies. In theory, such a formation should have adapted better than most to difficult conditions. In practice, it became a case study in how scale and complexity can magnify failure when logistics falter. As winter deepened, fuel shortages, limited mobility maintenance cycles slipped, and spare parts failed to reach forward units. Tanks that could not be kept running were hidden, abandoned, or cannibalized, turning prized assets into static burdens. Manpower told a similar story. Attrition was not simply about casualties, it was about exhaustion. Units rotated less frequently, replacements arrived inconsistently, and cohesion suffered. Soldiers trained for armored maneuvers were increasingly ordered into roles that did not match their preparation, often advancing on foot through exposed terrain. The mismatch between training and task drained morale and eroded trust in command decisions. An elite label offered little protection against cold, hunger, and uncertainty. Fragmentation became the defining feature. Instead of operating as a unified force, the army splintered into pockets of resistance, each reacting to immediate threats rather than executing a shared plan. Communication gaps widened as equipment failed, and command posts relocated repeatedly to avoid detection. Orders arrived late or not at all. In some sectors, small groups held positions with no clear understanding of what lay on either flank. The very size that once promised dominance now complicated coordination. The environment amplified every weakness. Cold weather accelerated wear on vehicles and personnel alike. Fuel consumption rose while supply capacity shrank. Medical evacuation slowed, turning injuries that might have been survivable into permanent losses. Fatigue accumulated without relief. In these conditions, the margin between discipline and breakdown narrowed sharply. Reports of units pulling back without authorization or refusing high-risk orders were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of systemic strain. Leadership faced its own dilemma. Admitting the scale of the problem risked political consequences, yet denying it delayed corrective action. The result was a cycle of unrealistic expectations passed down the chain of command. Objectives remained ambitious even as resources dwindled. The pressure to demonstrate progress encouraged continued commitment of depleted units rather than consolidation or pause. Each failed push further weakened the force, creating a feedback loop of decline. The symbolic cost was as damaging as the operational one. When a formation known for protecting the heart of the state appears vulnerable, the message travels far beyond the battlefield. Allies recalibrate expectations, adversaries reassess risks, and domestic audiences begin to question narratives of control. The First Guards Tank Army was not just losing ground, it was losing credibility as a reliable instrument of power. As winter tightened its grip and the army's cohesion continued to fray, the question shifted from whether it could advance to whether it could even stabilize its position. And if such a force could be worn down so thoroughly by logistics weather and modern surveillance, what did that imply for other units facing the same conditions? with fewer resources and lower priority. What happens when 20th century doctrine collides with 21st century surveillance? The answer unfolded starkly across frozen fields, where traditional armored tactics met an environment saturated with sensors, drones, and precision fire. The battlefield no longer rewarded mass alone. Instead, visibility detection speed and remote strike capability dictated survival. In this setting, heavy armor, once the centerpiece of offensive power, became both a shield and a liability. Cold weather intensified this imbalance. In sub-zero temperatures, the heat signature of running engines stood out sharply against snow-covered terrain. Armored vehicles could be identified from long distances, tracked persistently, and engaged before they reached effective range. Attempting to move tanks in daylight invited immediate attention. Moving them at night reduced visibility for crews already strained by fatigue and freezing conditions. The result was hesitation at the command level. Losing expensive equipment carried consequences far beyond the tactical loss itself, encouraging risk-averse decisions that contradicted offensive intent. To preserve armor, commanders increasingly shifted the burden onto infantry. Units were ordered to probe defenses on foot, often without adequate cover or support. These movements were described as infiltration, but functioned more like exposure. Snow slowed progress, amplified noise, and erased concealment. Soldiers carrying heavy loads over long distances arrived exhausted, their equipment affected by cold, their communications unreliable. The environment stripped away surprise, leaving little more than endurance to determine outcomes. Above them, drones transformed the fight. Small, persistent platforms provided continuous observation, relaying movements in near real time. Artillery and mortars responded with precision, turning detected formations into targets within minutes. The delay between detection and engagement shrank to the point where traditional maneuver became almost impossible. Attempts to exploit gaps were quickly countered not by massed fire, but by coordinated layered responses that punished exposure. This dynamic shifted the cost equation dramatically. Infantry assaults that once might have tested defenses now resulted in disproportionate losses. The absence of armored support reduced both protection and psychological confidence. Soldiers understood they were visible, tracked, and vulnerable long before contact. Each advance carried a sense of inevitability rather than opportunity. Over time, this awareness eroded willingness to comply with orders that seemed detached from reality on the ground. The contrast with defensive posture was stark. Forces equipped with modern sensors, hardened shelters, and reliable logistics could afford patience. They let technology do the work, conserving manpower while imposing attrition. The cold that drained attackers' strength reinforced defenders' advantage, freezing the battlefield into predictable patterns of exposure and response. Winter did not neutralize drones, it enhanced them. This tactical mismatch revealed a deeper issue: adaptation lag. Modern warfare demands rapid integration of new tools and methods, especially when adversaries exploit them effectively. Clinging to legacy concepts under these conditions becomes costly. The reliance on infantry to compensate for armored vulnerability signaled not innovation, but constraint. It exposed a gap between doctrine and reality that widened with each failed attempt. The implications extended beyond a single sector. As similar patterns emerged elsewhere, it became clear that this was not an isolated miscalculation, but a systemic challenge. The battlefield had evolved faster than some forces could adjust, and winter magnified the consequences. If dominance in the air, however low and unmanned, could so decisively shape ground combat, what did that mean for future operations across other fronts and theaters where similar technologies were already in play? When pressure builds at the front, the first cracks rarely appear on maps. They appear in behavior. Across multiple sectors, the strain that had been accumulating through winter began to surface in actions that commanders could no longer fully control. Orders were delayed, questioned, or quietly ignored. Units withdrew without coordination, not as part of a planned maneuver, but as a reflexive response to unsustainable conditions. What looked like isolated incidents at first gradually formed a pattern revealing how battlefield stress can trigger a cascading breakdown. Refusals to advance were among the most telling signs. These were not ideological protests or political statements. They were pragmatic decisions made by soldiers confronting the limits of endurance. Frostbite exhaustion and inadequate resupply turned risk calculations upside down. When advancing meant near-certain detection and engagement, the incentive to comply with aggressive orders diminished sharply. Some units chose to hold ground longer than instructed, others pulled back to more defensible positions, and a few abandoned equipment that could not be moved. Each choice taken individually made sense in context. Together, they undermined coherence. The psychological gap between official messaging and frontline reality widened dangerously. Reports of progress and control clashed with lived experience of isolation and loss. This dissonance mattered. Confidence in leadership depends on credibility, and credibility erodes when promises consistently fail to match outcomes. Soldiers who felt misled became less responsive to direction, relying instead on immediate judgment. Discipline, once maintained by structure and expectation, increasingly depended on survival instinct. This erosion spread laterally. Neighboring units observed each other's actions, learning what was tolerated and what was punished. When unauthorized withdrawals went unpunished due to lack of enforcement capacity, they set precedents. When units that stayed suffered heavy losses, the lesson traveled faster than any order. The front became uneven, not just in terrain control, but in morale and willingness to fight. Gaps emerged, not because defenses were breached, but because cohesion dissolved. The consequences reached command levels. Managing a battlefield requires accurate information, yet fragmentation distorted reporting. Overstated successes masked vulnerabilities, while understated losses delayed reinforcement. Decision-makers faced a distorted picture, responding with plans that no longer fit conditions. This feedback loop, misreporting leading to misallocation, accelerated decline. By the time corrective measures were considered, options had narrowed. Such chain reactions are difficult to reverse once underway. Rebuilding trust takes time, and time is a scarce resource during active operations. Rotations, rest, and resupply can stabilize a front, but winter and ongoing engagement limited those options. Every day spent holding under pressure increased fatigue and resentment. The cost was not just tactical ground, but institutional confidence. The broader implication was clear: frontline behavior can reshape strategy as much as strategy shapes the front. When soldiers adapt faster than doctrine, they expose the limits of centralized control. The winter campaign demonstrated how quickly localized stress can escalate into systemic risk. And if these dynamics could destabilize one front under sustained pressure, what might happen if similar conditions converged elsewhere, simultaneously stretching command capacity even further? If a single front can expose structural weakness, what happens when those signals are read globally? By 2025, the consequences of winter setbacks in eastern Ukraine were no longer confined to local calculations. They began influencing how military planners, political leaders, and defense institutions across the world interpreted risk, readiness, and escalation. The battlefield had become a reference point, not just for what was happening, but for what might happen elsewhere under similar pressures. For NATO and its partners, the lessons were immediate. The effectiveness of layered surveillance, precision strike capability, and sustained logistics validated years of investment in interoperability and technology-driven defense. It also reinforced the importance of endurance over spectacle. Rather than decisive breakthroughs, the conflict demonstrated how attrition combined with information dominance could neutralize larger formations. This understanding shaped force posture debates, especially along alliance frontiers, where deterrence depends as much on credibility as on numbers. The conflict also intersected with broader global tensions. As attention remained fixed on Ukraine, parallel theaters simmered. In the Middle East, confrontations involving Iran and Israel highlighted how drone warfare, missile defense, and proxy forces could escalate rapidly without conventional declarations. In East Asia, the United States and China continued to test each other's thresholds through exercises, deployments, and signaling. The common thread was technological saturation. Sensors, unmanned systems, and rapid response weapons compressed decision timelines everywhere. The winter campaign underscored how quickly assumptions can fail under these conditions. Large formations require uninterrupted supply chains and protected command structures. When those are disrupted, size becomes a liability. This realization resonated beyond Europe. Defense planners reassessed how armored and mechanized units would fare against adversaries equipped with persistent surveillance and precision fires. The answer was sobering: adaptation must be continuous, not reactive. Politically, the situation altered leverage. Setbacks weakened bargaining positions and narrowed options. For Western policymakers, supporting Ukraine became less about preventing collapse and more about consolidating advantage. Aid discussions increasingly focused on sustainability, integration, and long-term deterrence rather than emergency response. The goal shifted from short-term survival to shaping post-war security architecture. At the same time, the risk of miscalculation grew. As one side struggled to regain momentum, the temptation to escalate through unconventional means increased. Cyber operations, long-range strikes, and hybrid tactics offered alternatives to costly frontal assaults. These tools blurred the line between regional conflict and broader confrontation. Each action carried the potential to trigger responses far beyond the immediate battlefield. Expert assessments converged on a central insight: modern war punishes rigidity. Systems that cannot adapt to rapid feedback loops falter regardless of tradition or reputation. The winter experience served as a case study in how legacy power can be eroded without dramatic defeat, simply through sustained pressure and exposure. As these shockwaves rippled outward, the question facing strategists was no longer whether the conflict would influence global security, but how deeply. Would the lessons learned lead to restraint and recalibration, or encourage new forms of escalation as states tested the limits revealed by this winter's fighting? Can a war be sustained when the battlefield drains faster than the treasury can refill? By early 2026, that question moved from abstract debate to practical concern. Military strain and economic pressure began reinforcing each other, creating a cycle that narrowed strategic options. What unfolded was not a sudden financial collapse, but a grinding squeeze that limited flexibility, amplified risk, and reshaped decision-making at the highest levels. The cost of prolonged operations rose steadily. Maintaining forces in winter conditions required more fuel, more maintenance, and more logistics per unit of combat power. Each failure at the front carried a financial echo. Damaged equipment needed replacement, personnel losses demanded compensation, and emergency measures diverted funds from long-term planning. Spending surged even as efficiency declined. This imbalance strained budgets already under pressure from sanctions, disrupted trade, and reduced export revenues. Revenue challenges compounded the problem. Energy income, long a stabilizing pillar, became less predictable amid shifting markets and price volatility. Discounts demanded by buyers eroded margins, while logistical bottlenecks limited volume. At the same time, inflation at home increased the cost of everything from food to basic services, raising social pressure. The war's price was no longer confined to spreadsheets. It reached households, businesses, and regional governments, each competing for shrinking resources. To bridge gaps, reserves were tapped. Emergency funds provided temporary relief, but their finite nature imposed hard limits. Using them solved immediate problems while postponing structural ones. This approach bought time, but reduced resilience. The longer the conflict dragged on, the fewer buffers remained against unexpected shocks, whether economic downturns, infrastructure failures, or new security crises. These constraints influenced military choices. High-risk operations became harder to justify when replacement costs soared. Precision mattered more than volume, not only tactically, but financially. Each decision to push forward carried an implicit calculation about sustainability. Escalation promised potential gains, but threatened deeper exposure. De-escalation preserved resources but risked strategic momentum. The margin for error shrank. Internationally, economic signals shaped perceptions. Partners and adversaries alike assessed endurance as carefully as firepower. Financial stress undermined confidence in long-term commitments and complicated diplomacy. It also affected alliance dynamics as support strategies weighed cost-sharing, industrial capacity, and political will. The conflict's economic dimension blurred the line between military and financial warfare, making balance sheets as consequential as battle maps. At home, public tolerance became a variable. Sustained hardship tested narratives of inevitability and control. While information management could delay discontent, it could not erase lived experience. Over time, economic reality asserted itself through prices, shortages, and uncertainty. The longer the war continued without clear progress, the more difficult it became to justify sacrifice. The endgame question thus emerged, not as a single decision point, but as a narrowing corridor of options. Victory required resources that were becoming harder to mobilize. Compromise carried political risks. Continuation promised further erosion. Winter had exposed operational weaknesses. Economic pressure threatened to lock them in. As military realities and financial limits converged, the central uncertainty remained unresolved. Would adaptation and restraint redefine objectives? Or would the pursuit of momentum override caution despite rising costs? And if economics ultimately sets the boundaries of war, how close was the conflict to reaching those boundaries?